Hey, Algebra 2 Trig, I'm a horrible teacher, but Vivian is an even worse TA. And we are doing 5.6 inverse trig functions. And the essential question is, how do I solve inverse trig equations and expressions? Okay, so before we start, I need to talk about what an inverse is. So if you remember, let's just write a normal trig equation, y equals sine x. So if you remember what we did with old inverses, what we did with inverses before, we switched the y and the x. So I'm going to switch the y and the x. So now it's going to be x equals sine of y. Okay, then I need to solve for y if you remember old when we used inverses. So in order to get rid of sine, you can't divide by sine because I'm doing the sine of an angle. So we're going to introduce a new thing. It's called the inverse trig function. So this is inverse sine. So it's not sine to the negative 1. So I'm going to inverse sine both sides. You can kind of think of this as like e's and ln's and whatnot. Remember, you e and ln and then it goes away, and ln and e goes away. So I'm going to arc sine or inverse sine, either way you want to say it, sine. Okay, so when I inverse sine, the signs go away. Okay, so I'm left with y equals inverse sine of x. Okay, and again, another way to say it is arc sine. Okay, so this is how we came up with this equation. So remember this equation, and go ahead and write this down. Okay, so again, this is how they got these equations. This is how they got y equals arc sine of x. Again, the arc sine means inverse sine. And the most important thing to remember in this whole thing is you need to remember the range. It is very important that the range stays in between here. And the domain you'll have to remember, but the range is the most important part. So please remember the range, and we'll talk about it tomorrow in the Google form. Okay? All right, and then let's do an example. Okay? So example 1 is find the exact value of arctan of radical 3 over 3. Okay? Oops, sorry, no equal sign. Okay, so the when it says exact value, underline exact value, whenever you see the word exact value, you are going to look on your unit circle. That is the most important thing. So when you see the word exact value, please look on your unit circle. So I'm going to look at my unit circle. Okay, and then let's look at the equation arctan of radical 3. Well, how do we even get to this part? So to begin, I need to ask myself, okay, what equation it is. Well, let's just start with tangent of theta equals radical 3 over 3. Okay, so you've seen something like this before, right? And really you're asking, the variable in here is theta, so you're asking what angle is tangent radical 3 over 3? Well, to solve for theta, I'm going to inverse tan, like I showed you in the beginning. So I'm going to inverse tan both sides. So if I inverse tan both sides, well, the tans go away, so theta equals inverse tan of radical 3 over 3. Okay? So if you look, the inverse tan is the same thing as this. This is pretty much, these two are the same thing. So you're asking what angle is tangent, at what angle is tangent radical 3 over 3? Well, if I look on my unit circle, here's a unit circle. Here's an example of unit circle. Okay? Tangent is radical 3 over 3 at pi over 6 and also at 7 pi over 6. Okay? So tangent is radical 3 over here. It's in two different spots. But the problem is I need to go back to my book and look at the range. So if I look at the range of this, tangent, the range of tangent has to be between pi over 2 and negative pi over 2. Okay? So if it's radical 3 over 3. Well, what's between pi over 2 and negative pi over 2? So it would be, well, between pi over 2 is here, so it's between 9 degrees, and negative pi over 2, so it's in quadrants 1 and 4. So where is tangent radical 3 over 3? Well, it's at pi over 6. So your answer is pi over 6. Okay, I'll do another one that's a little trickier. We can do one where, let's do find the exact value. We'll do the same example one. So find the exact value of, let's do inverse sine of negative 1/2. Okay. So if I look at what angle is sine negative 1/2? Well, if I look here on my unit circle, there's two spots where it's negative 1/2. It is at 11 pi over 6 and 7 pi over 6 because sine is my y value. Okay. Well, if I look at the range is between negative, for sine it's between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So it's in quadrants 1 and 4. So it would be 11 pi over 6. However, that's not within my range. I need to write this so that is between 0 to negative pi over 2. So instead, another way to write it, we talked about coterminal angles. Another way to write 330 is negative 30 degrees. So instead of writing 11 pi over 6, I can go this way, and it would be negative pi over 6. So the answer to this is negative pi over 6. And the reason why it's an exact value, because pi is an irrational number, so if I write pi, this is an exact value, whereas I'm not rounding or estimating. Okay? All right, let's do example 2. Okay, example 2, we're going to find an approximate value for arc cosine of 0.75. Okay, so the reason why this is an approximate value is because it is not an exact value, because this doesn't look like a unit circle value to me. So I am going to use my calculator when it says find an approximate value. So this is what you're going to do. Number 1, you need to make sure you are in radians. Okay, so if it says RAD, we work in radians. Okay. And then I'm going to do, depends on your calculator, but I'm going to do 0.75, and then to arc cosine it, if you can see. Okay, so you're usually going to, on your calculator, you'll see a cosine, and then there'll be an arc cosine. So if I press the second key, it'll turn into arc cosine. So I'm going to press arc cosine after the 0.75. And the answer should be 0.72. So my answer to that is 0.72. And make sure you can know how to do that on your calculator. Okay? All right, and then we'll do one more problem. Example 3. Okay, we are going to write theta as a function of x. So they're going to give you a triangle, and we've seen these triangles before. Here's theta, here's x over 8. So I want to pretty much just write an equation involving where I get theta equals. Well, if I look at this triangle, I'm given the opposite and I'm giving the adjacent. So I'm going to use tangent, because tangent is opposite over adjacent. So tangent of theta equals x over 8. And again, I'm solving for theta, so how would I solve for theta? I'm going to inverse tan both sides to get rid of that tangent so I can solve for theta. Okay, so the inverse tan and the tan go away, so theta equals the inverse tan of x over 8. And I wrote theta as a function of x, so this is my function of x. Okay, if you have any questions, go ahead and write it down, and we will answer it tomorrow.
Vivian's the best TA.
Vivian is the worst TA.